I still remember the morning Ellie told me she was pregnant. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray-ski day that makes you want to stay in bed with a cup of coffee and a good book. I was in the kitchen, fumbling with the toaster, when she came up behind me, her hands trembling as she held out the little white stick with 2 pink lines. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but shaky, "we're going to have a baby." I dropped the toast. It hit the floor, crumbs scattering like confetti, and I just stood there, staring at her. Ellie's eyes were wide, a mix of fear and something else, excitement maybe. I pulled her into my arms, laughing like an idiot, and for the first time in years, I felt like life was handing me something good. We'd been married 5 years, and though we'd talked about kids, it always seemed like a someday thing. Now someday was here, and I couldn't stop grinning. The next few weeks were a blur. I started planning, well, over-planning, if I'm honest. I'd lie awake at night, imagining a little boy with Ellie's green eyes or a girl with my stubborn chin. I even bought a crib off some guy on the internet, hauled it home in the back of my truck, and spent a whole weekend sanding it down in the garage. Ellie teased me about it, said I was nesting more than she was, but I could tell she loved it. She'd sit on the porch with her tea, watching me work, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. But something was off, even then. I didn't see it at the time. Hindsight's a cruel thing, but there were moments. Like how she'd get quiet when I talked about the future, or how she'd flinch just slightly when I'd kiss her forehead. I chalked it up to nerves. First pregnancies are hard, right? That's what all the books said. I bought a stack of them, piled them on the nightstand, and read bits aloud to her until she'd laugh and tell me to stop. One night, maybe a month in, she woke me up sobbing. I bolted upright, heart pounding, thinking something was wrong with the baby. "Ellie, what is it?" I asked, fumbling for the lamp. She wouldn't look at me, just buried her face in her hands and said, "I don't know if I can do this." I held her, told her we'd figure it out together, that she was stronger than she knew. She nodded, but there was a distance in her eyes that stayed long after the tears dried. Looking back, that was the first crack. I didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of a story I never saw coming, one that'd unravel everything I thought I knew about us. The months rolled on, and Ellie's belly started to show. It was subtle at first, just a gentle curve under her sweaters, but by the 5th month, there was no hiding it. I'd catch myself staring, amazed at how her body was changing, how it was building something, someone new. We'd lie in bed, my hand on her stomach, waiting for those tiny kicks. When they came, I'd laugh, and she'd smile, but it was a tired smile, like she was carrying more than just the baby. Work kept me busy. I'm a mechanic, and the shop was slammed that spring, cars breaking down left and right with the first heat wave. I'd come home greasy and exhausted, but I'd still try to make Ellie laugh, telling her about the guy who swore his pickup truck could talk. She'd nod, force a chuckle, but her mind seemed elsewhere. I figured it was hormones, or maybe the heat getting to her. The house was old, drafty in winter, and a furnace in summer, and the AC unit rattled like it was on its last legs. That's when the faucet broke. It was a Saturday, and I was under a sedan at the shop when Ellie called. "Jack, the kitchen's flooding," she said, her voice tight. "Can you fix it?" I told her I'd be home soon, but by the time I got there, she'd already called someone. The plumber's van was in the driveway, a beat-up thing with "Russo's Repairs" painted on the side in chipped red letters. I walked in to find Ellie mopping the floor, her hair tied back, and this guy, tall, broad-shouldered, with a mop of dark hair, crouched under the sink. "Fixed it already," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. His name was Tony, he told me, shaking my hand with a grip that lingered a beat too long. Ellie thanked him, handed him some cash, and he left with a nod and a grin that struck me as odd, too familiar maybe. I didn't dwell on it. The kitchen was dry, and Ellie seemed relieved, so I let it go. But after that, things shifted. Ellie started fussing over little stuff, reorganizing cabinets, buying new curtains, like she was distracting herself. Once, I came home early and found her on the phone, her voice low. She hung up quick when she saw me, said it was her sister, but her cheeks were flushed, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked if everything was okay, and she nodded too fast. "Just tired," she said, and I believed her because I wanted to. Looking back, I should have asked more questions. That plumber's visit was a pebble in the stream, and I didn't see the ripples until they turned into waves. By the 6th month, Ellie's pregnancy was undeniable. She'd waddle around the house, one hand on her lower back, and I'd tease her about it, calling her my little penguin. She'd roll her eyes, but there was a flicker of warmth in them, a reminder of the Ellie I'd fallen for, the one who'd dance with me in the living room to no music at all. Those moments were rarer now, though. She'd gotten quiet, introspective, and I told myself it was normal. The book said expectant mothers could withdraw sometimes, processing the changes. I clung to that explanation like a lifeline. Work was still a grind, but I made time for her. I'd bring home flowers, wild ones I'd pick from the empty lot near the shop, or little treats, like the lemon scones she loved from the bakery downtown. She'd thank me, but her smiles were fleeting, and she'd retreat to the nursery we were setting up, painting the walls a soft yellow. I'd offer to help, but she'd wave me off, saying she needed the alone time. I didn't push. Maybe I should have. One evening, I came home to find the house empty. No note, no call, just her car gone from the driveway. My stomach twisted, but I told myself she'd probably gone to her sister's. I called her cell. It went straight to voicemail. An hour later, she walked in, cheeks pink from the cool night air, carrying a bag of groceries. "Needed some air," she said, avoiding my gaze as she unpacked apples and a loaf of bread. I asked where she'd been, and she shrugged. "Just drove around, then stopped at the store." Her tone was flat, final, so I dropped it. The next day, I found a receipt crumpled in the trash, dated that evening, from a gas station 20 miles out of town. We didn't need gas. The tank was full. I stared at it, my mind spinning, but when I asked her about it later, she frowned like I'd lost my mind. "I don't remember stopping there," she said. "Maybe it's old." It wasn't. The date was clear as day, but her eyes dared me to argue, and I didn't. I tossed it back in the bin, feeling like an idiot for doubting her. Then there was the mail. A week later, I grabbed the stack from the box, bills, junk, the usual, and saw an envelope with no return address, just her name in blocky handwriting. I handed it to her, curious, and she snatched it quick, muttering something about a baby shower invite. She didn't open it in front of me, just tucked it into her pocket and changed the subject. That night, I heard her crying in the bathroom, but when I knocked, she said she was fine, just hormonal. The cracks were widening, and I was too blind, or too scared, to see what was breaking. Ellie hit her 7th month, and the baby was kicking like crazy. I'd press my ear to her belly sometimes, listening to the little thumps, and for a moment, everything felt right. We picked a name, Liam, after my granddad, and I'd started imagining him, a scrappy kid with a big laugh, tearing around the backyard. Ellie would nod when I talked about it, but her enthusiasm felt forced, like she was reading from a script. I told myself it was fatigue. She was sleeping less, tossing and turning, and I'd wake up to an empty bed more nights than not. One morning, I found her in the kitchen, staring out the window at nothing. The sink was dripping again, slow, steady plinks into a coffee mug she'd left there. "I'll call Tony," she said before I could offer to fix it. I raised an eyebrow. The plumber? It's just a drip. I can handle it. She shook her head, insistent. He's quick. I don't want you messing with it and making it worse. Her tone had an edge, and I backed off, puzzled but not enough to fight over a faucet. Tony showed up that afternoon. I was home this time, tinkering in the garage, and I watched him pull up in that same rusty van. He waved at me, all casual, then headed inside. I followed a few minutes later, curious. Ellie was leaning against the counter, chatting with him while he worked. Nothing big, just small talk about the weather, but she seemed lighter, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. It stung, though I couldn't say why. He finished fast, took her cash, and left with that same grin I'd noticed before. I asked her later why she called him instead of letting me try. He's good at what he does, she said, shrugging, and that was that. A few days later, I was cleaning out the truck and found a scrap of paper wedged under the passenger seat. It was a handwritten note. Tuesday 3, same place. No signature, just those words in that same blocky script from the envelope. My chest tightened. Tuesday was the day she disappeared for hours, the gas station receipt day. I confronted her that night, holding the note up. She froze, then snatched it from me. It's nothing, Jack. Just a reminder from my sister about lunch. Her voice was sharp, defensive, and I wanted to believe her, but the math didn't add up. Her sister lived 2 blocks away, not 20 miles. That night, she slept on the couch. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the drip of that faucet echoing in my head like a countdown to something I couldn't name. Ellie was 8 months along now, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. The nursery was ready, yellow walls, crib assembled, a mobile with little stars dangling above it, but she barely went in there anymore. She'd sit in the living room instead, staring at her phone or out the window, her hands resting on her swollen belly like it was a stranger's. I'd try to pull her out of it, suggesting walks or baby classes, but she'd just say, maybe later, and later never came. I started noticing things, small, nagging details. Her phone was always face down now, and she'd take it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. Once, it buzzed while she was in the shower, and I glanced at the screen. A text just, call me. The name didn't register at first, but then it clicked, Tony the plumber. I stood there, water running in the background, my pulse thudding in my ears. When she came out, towel wrapped and damp, I asked who T was. She blinked, then laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. My cousin Tara, you dope. She's been checking in. I nodded, but Tara lived in Oregon, and we hadn't heard from her in years. The next day, I came home early. Ellie wasn't there, but her car was. The back door was ajar, and I found a coffee mug on the counter, lipstick on the rim, not her shade. My gut twisted. I called her, got voicemail again, and waited. She rolled in an hour later, claiming she'd been at the neighbor's, but Mrs. Carter next door was out of town. I'd seen her leave that morning. Ellie brushed it off, said I was paranoid, and stormed upstairs. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat in the kitchen, staring at that mug, its red stain like a taunt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I slipped out of bed and rummaged through her coat pockets, something I'd never done before, something I hated myself for doing now. I found a folded receipt, not from a store, but a diner 30 miles away, dated 2 days back. 2 coffees, 2 meals. She'd said she'd been home all day. I shoved it back, my hand shaking, and told myself I was overreacting. People lie about little things, right? It didn't mean anything. But the next morning, she got a call while we were eating breakfast. She glanced at the screen, paled, and excused herself to the porch. I watched through the window as she paced, her voice too low to hear, her free hand tugging at her hair. When she came back, her eyes were red, and she said it was her mom, upset about something trivial. I didn't buy it, but I didn't push. I was starting to wonder what I'd find if I did. Ellie's 9th month crept in, and the air between us thickened with something I couldn't name. She was huge now, glowing in that way pregnant women do, but her eyes were hollow, like she was haunting her own body. I'd catch her staring at me sometimes, a look I couldn't read, guilt, maybe, or fear, and then she'd turn away, busying herself with folding laundry or wiping down counters that were already clean. I stopped asking if she was okay. The answers were always the same, and they never felt true. The phone calls kept coming. She'd take them outside or in the bathroom, door locked, her voice a muffled hum through the walls. Once, I pressed my ear to the wood, hating myself for it, and caught fragments. Not now, and I can't. When she emerged, she jumped seeing me there, then snapped that she needed privacy. "It's just family stuff, Jack," she said, but her hands trembled as she shoved the phone into her pocket. I let it go, but the questions gnawed at me like termites in the walls of our old house. Then there was the package. It arrived on a rainy Thursday, a small padded envelope with her name in that blocky script I'd seen before. I was home when the mail came, and I handed it to her, watching her face. She went still, then muttered something about a gift from a friend and tucked it under her arm. Later, I found the envelope torn open in the trash. No contents, just the wrapper, but the postmark was from a town an hour away. She hadn't mentioned any friends there. I asked about it over dinner, casual as I could manage. "Oh, just some baby stuff," she said, poking at her food. "Nothing special." Her fork clattered too loud against the plate. That night, I woke to her whispering in the dark. She was on the phone again, by the window, moonlight cutting her silhouette. I stayed still, pretending to sleep, and heard her say, "It's almost time. I don't know how much longer." She stopped, listened, then hung up and climbed back into bed. Her breathing was uneven, and I lay there, heart pounding, wondering who was on the other end and why. Almost time sounded like a deadline. The next day, I fixed the faucet myself. It was a simple washer swap, nothing Tony couldn't have done blindfolded, but I needed to feel useful. Ellie watched me from the doorway, arms crossed over her belly. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice flat. "I know," I replied, tightening the last bolt. "But I wanted to." She didn't smile, just turned away, and I wondered if she'd have called him if I hadn't been there. Ellie's due date loomed, just weeks away, and the house felt like a pressure cooker. We'd packed her hospital bag, tiny onesies, a soft blanket, my old baseball cap for Liam to grow into, but it sat by the door like a prop in a play we weren't ready to perform. She'd stopped talking about the baby unless I brought it up, and even then, her answers were clipped, her eyes darting away. I'd catch her rubbing her belly absent-mindedly, but there was no joy in it, only a quiet weight I couldn't lift. I tried to bridge the gap. One night, I made her favorite, chicken pot pie from scratch, and lit a candle on the table, hoping for a spark of the old US. She picked at it, forcing a smile, and said it was good, but halfway through, she pushed her plate away and said she wasn't hungry. "I'm just tired, Jack," she murmured, and I nodded, clearing the dishes in silence. The candle flickered out before I finished washing up. The next morning, I found a key on the counter, one I didn't recognize, small and brass, not from our house. I held it up when she came downstairs. "Yours?" I asked. She froze, then snatched it quick. "Yeah, from my old apartment," she said, shoving it into her pocket. "Must have fallen out." We'd moved in together years ago, and that place was long gone. I didn't call her on it, but the lie hung there, sharp and cold. Later that week, I came home to Tony's van in the driveway again. My stomach dropped. I walked in, and he was in the kitchen, toolbox open, while Ellie hovered nearby, holding a glass of water she didn't drink. "Pipe's leaking," she said, not meeting my eyes. Tony grinned, wiping his hands. "No biggie, just a quick fix." I nodded, but I checked every pipe that morning. Nothing was wrong. He left fast, and I asked Ellie why she hadn't called me. "You were at work," she said, shrugging. "He was closer." "Closer how?" I wanted to ask, but her jaw was set, and I let it drop. That night, I heard her crying again, soft sobs from the nursery. I stood outside the door, listening, and caught her whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." To who? The baby? Me? Someone else? I knocked, and she went quiet, then opened the door, eyes puffy but dry. "Bad dream," she said, brushing past me. I didn't follow her back to bed. Instead, I sat in the nursery, staring at the crib, the stars on the mobile spinning slow in the dark, and felt the ground shifting under me. Ellie's due date was days away, and the tension in the house was a living thing, coiling tighter with every breath. She barely spoke to me now, moving through our routines like a ghost, making coffee, folding towels, staring out windows. I tried to reach her, asking about Liam's first outfit or if she wanted me to paint the rocking chair, but she'd just nod or shrug, her eyes somewhere I couldn't follow. I started to feel like a stranger in my own life. One afternoon, I came home early from the shop, hands still smudged with grease, and heard voices in the backyard. I peeked through the kitchen window. Ellie was there, pacing near the shed, talking to someone on the phone. Her voice was low, urgent, and she kept glancing at the house, like she was afraid I'd catch her. "I can't keep doing this," I heard her say, sharp and broken, before she hung up and pressed her forehead against the shed door. I stepped outside, and she spun around, startled. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Mom," she said, too quick. "She's worried about the delivery." Her mom hadn't called in months. I'd spoken to her last week. I let it slide, but the next day, I found her coat on the couch, a folded note slipping from the pocket. I unfolded it. Friday. You know where. T. That blocky script again. Friday was tomorrow. My chest burned, but when I asked her about plans, she said she was staying home, maybe resting. "Doctor's orders," she added, smiling faintly. I nodded, but I marked the calendar in my head. Thursday night, she went into labor. It was sudden. Her water broke while we were watching TV, a puddle on the couch, and she gasped, clutching her belly. I grabbed the bag, helped her to the truck, and drove to the hospital, my hand shaking on the wheel. She was quiet, breathing hard, and I kept saying, "We're almost there, Ellie, you're doing great," like a mantra to calm us both. The nurses whisked her away, and I paced the waiting room, adrenaline surging, trying to focus on Liam, on being a dad. Hours later, they let me in. Ellie was in bed, pale and sweaty, holding a tiny bundle. I rushed over, heart in my throat, and looked at him, red-faced, squirming, perfect. "Liam," I whispered, touching his tiny hand. Ellie watched me, her expression unreadable, and said nothing. I didn't notice then, but her silence wasn't joy. It was something heavier, something waiting to crack wide open. Liam came home with us 2 days later, a squalling little bundle that turned my world upside down. I'd never felt anything like it, holding him, so small and fragile, his tiny fists curling against my chest. I'd sit in the nursery for hours, rocking him while Ellie slept, whispering promises about teaching him to throw a ball or fix a carburetor. He had my dark hair, I thought, though babies change fast, and I clung to that like it proved something. Ellie was different after the birth. I expected exhaustion, sleepless nights, feeding struggles, but it was more than that. She'd hold Liam, feed him, change him, but it was mechanical, like she was going through motions she'd memorized. When I'd catch her staring at him, her face was blank, or worse, pained, like she was looking at a puzzle she couldn't solve. I asked if she was okay, if she needed to talk to someone, a doctor maybe. "I'm fine, Jack," she'd snap, then soften. "Just adjusting." I'd bought it, or tried to. The house felt off too. People sent cards and gifts, booties, a stuffed bear, but Ellie barely touched them, leaving them piled on the counter. One day, a package arrived, no return address, just her name in that familiar blocky script. I handed it to her, watching close. She said it was from her sister, but her hand shook as she took it to the bedroom and shut the door. I heard paper tearing, then silence. When she came out, her eyes were red, and she said she needed a nap. The trash later held the envelope, empty again. Tony showed up unannounced a week later. I opened the door, Liam fussing in my arms, and there he was, toolbox in hand, grinning like we were old pals. "Heard you had a kid," he said. "Thought I'd check the pipes. New parents don't need leaks." I hadn't called him, and the pipes were fine. I'd fixed them myself. Ellie appeared behind me, tense, and said, "That's nice, but we're good." He nodded, lingered a second too long, then left. I turned to her. "How do you know about Liam?" She shrugged. "Small town. Word gets around." Maybe, but it gnawed me. That night, I found her phone unlocked on the couch. Rare, since she guarded it like a vault. A text thread was open, unsaved number. "He's here." "What now?" Her reply. "I don't know. Give me time." My stomach dropped. I scrolled up, more messages, vague but urgent. "Meet me. It's too late to back out." I put it down before she caught me, my mind racing. Liam cried upstairs, and I went to him, rocking him while the questions spun, louder than his wails. Liam was a month old, and the sleepless nights had carved shadows under my eyes, but I didn't care. He was worth it. His cries were my alarm clock, his gurgles my reward. I'd watch him sleep, tiny chest rising and falling, and feel this fierce, quiet love that almost hurt. Ellie, though, was slipping further away. She'd care for him, feed him, rock him, but her touch was distant, her smiles rare and thin. I'd ask how she was feeling, and she'd say, "Fine," like it was a wall she'd built between us. The phone kept buzzing. She'd silence it quick, shove it in her pocket, and if I asked who it was, she'd mumble about telemarketers or her mom. But I'd seen the text that night, and, fine, wasn't cutting it anymore. I started paying attention. How she'd leave the room to answer calls, how she'd tense when the mail came. One day, I found a scrap of paper in her jeans while doing laundry. "Tea Saturday, too." Usual. That blocky handwriting again. Saturday was tomorrow. I didn't say anything, just pocketed it and waited. Friday night, she said she needed air, grabbed her keys, and left. Liam was napping, so I stayed, but I watched her taillights fade down the street. She was gone 2 hours. Came back with a bag of diapers she could have gotten blocks away, her hair mussed, eyes avoiding mine. "Long line," she said when I asked. I nodded, but the gas gauge was lower than it had been that morning. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the dark, Liam's soft breaths beside me, the note burning a hole in my mind. Saturday, she said she was visiting her sister. "Back by dinner," she promised, kissing Liam's forehead but not mine. I waited 10 minutes, then bundled him up and followed in the truck, keeping distance. She didn't go to her sister's. She drove out of town, to a diner off the highway, the same one from that old receipt. I parked across the lot, watched her go in. Tony was there, waiting at a booth. They sat close, heads bent, her hand on his arm. My throat closed up. I stayed until Liam fussed, then drove home numb. That night, she acted normal, cooked spaghetti, cooed at Liam, but I couldn't eat. I kept seeing them together, the ease of it. After she went to bed, I dug through her closet, found a locked box under a pile of sweaters. The brass key from weeks back fit. Inside, letters, photos of her and Tony, an ultrasound picture dated months before Liam, before I thought we'd started trying. My hand shook as I closed it, the truth clawing at me, but not yet whole. Liam was 6 weeks old, and the house was a battlefield of silence. I'd locked that box back up, shoved it under the sweaters, but its contents haunted me. Those letters, the ultrasound, Tony's face grinning next to Ellie's in faded photos. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed proof, something concrete to make sense of the storm in my head. She moved around me like nothing was wrong, humming to Liam, folding his tiny clothes, but I saw the cracks, her quick glances, the way her hands fidgeted when I got too close. I started watching closer. She'd sneak calls when she thought I was asleep, her voice a whisper from the porch. I'd check her phone when I could, passcode changed, but the call log showed unsaved numbers, late-night dials. One morning, I followed her again. She said she was grocery shopping, but she drove to that diner again. Tony's van was there. I stayed in the truck, Liam asleep in his car seat, and watched them through the window, her head in her hands, him leaning in, intense. They didn't touch, but the air between them screamed something I couldn't ignore. Back home, I dug deeper. I found an old bank statement in a drawer, withdrawals, small but regular, to a cash app one didn't know she had. Dates matched her. Errands. I called the shop, took a day off, and waited. She left that afternoon, saying she'd be quick. I followed, heart pounding, to a park 20 miles out. Tony was there, by a bench, and she handed him an envelope. He hugged her, brief, but tight, and left. She sat there after, staring at the ground, until Liam's cry on the monitor I'd brought pulled me back to the truck. That night I couldn't take it. After Liam was down, I sat her on the couch. "Ellie, what's going on?" I asked, voice steady but raw. She tensed, eyes darting. "What do you mean?" I pulled out the note. "Tea Saturday, too. Usual, and set it between us. This. The calls. Tony. Talk to me." She went pale, then angry. "You're spying on me? That's insane, Jack." She stood, but I grabbed her arm, gentle. "I'm not the one lying. Tell me the truth." She yanked free, tears welling. "I can't, not yet. Please just trust me." Trust her? After everything? I slept in the nursery that night, Liam's crib beside me, his soft snores a lifeline. The box, the letters, Tony's grin, they spun in my mind, pieces of a puzzle I was terrified to finish. But I knew I couldn't stop now. The truth was coming, whether I wanted it or not.